All right, well, thank you all very much for registering today. We've got a great panel, great discussion set up for purposes of today. We've got a lot of people on the phone, so it's a full house. We'll get started. We've got an hour webinar. We got a full stop, and we'll stop at 1 p.m. Eastern. So let's go ahead and get started. Today's focus is going to be on really the Mexican automotive suppliers, reducing dependence on China, specifically looking at critical automotive components from Mexican suppliers. And again, as we'll point out throughout this event, the key thing here is going to be, we're going to have a brief discussion at the beginning about China, about Mexico, and about the partners we've got who are going to be on the phone. But the main focus will be the questions that you all will be providing to us. We have got an 8-part session today. First, we'll give a brief introduction of East West, a brief introduction of Harris Bricken, and a brief introduction of Global Automotive Industry.com. Those are the three groups that are sponsoring this event. We'll then introduce the speakers, Gary Chazanka and also Stefan Lagner. Then we'll have a brief discussion on China, Mexico, and then getting straight on into the Q&A session. And the Q&A session will last about 45, 50 minutes. That's going to be the focus of this. So you all can all see on your panel control panels on the right-hand side, there's a place to put in questions. Please ask those questions. And then that will come back to me, and I will then be able to ask the speakers the questions. So we'll go to the next slide, and I'll provide a brief introduction on East West. We've got, East West. As president of East West, I'll just provide a brief background. We operate in 5 areas: the U.S., China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, Central Eastern Europe. We do primarily 2 things. We develop global manufacturing supply chain footprint strategies. And secondly, we do a lot of the implementation work on operational, supply chain, commercial and risk management strategies. Operational being everything related to the factory, such as executive searches, performance improvement of existing manufacturing operations, organizational assessments of plants, and a lot of closure and relocation, particularly in China right now. Supply chain is obviously everything about identifying suppliers, qualifying suppliers, supplier audits, supplier improvement practices. Commercial is obviously working with top line growth and risk management as it relates to today's conversation. We've got a team of ex-military and ex-police who do a lot of covert background checks for us, primarily on new suppliers and new employees. The concern about the suppliers is to find out really who owns them, how well that they are run, and see if they've ever been sued before, and to make sure that they don't also own other competing suppliers, because we've had plenty of scenarios where a U.S. company will have 4 or 5 suppliers in Mexico or China or Poland, where have they, and to find out all suppliers are owned by one family or one investor. And that's not a good place to be. And all the people in the East West executives have all held senior management positions for companies in our 5 regions. So here is our global reach. We've got executives on the ground in these 5 regions. So I'm now going to turn it over, and I'm going to ask Bob Kosik to introduce Harris Bricken. Bob, if you would provide a brief background, if you would, please.
Sure. Thanks, Alex, and thanks for making us a part of this. I am an attorney with Harris Bricken. Harris Bricken is a law firm that's based in Seattle, Washington. We have offices throughout the world, and I would characterize our practice as focusing primarily on international business and international trade. Within that, there's also recently developed a fairly robust cannabis practice. As for myself, I practice within the Customs and Trade Group. I'm a licensed customs broker, and I've actually worked in Mexico with law firms working on trade issues for several years as well. So thanks again for having us, Alex.
Sure, Bob. And you've actually lived in Mexico, I believe, for a while as well, right?
In fact, I wanted to pick Stefan's brain to hear about his experience, but we'll come back to that another day.
Okay. All right. We're going to introduce Global Automotive Industry.com. They are a partner of East West. They've been a great partner of us, East West. They're kind of a leading business intelligence source within the automotive industry. They've got great relations with all throughout the automotive chain, all the way from the OEMs all the way to the aftermarket. They've got good relations with firms such as ours, They do great work as far as getting good documented articles and newsletters out there. If you're not familiar with them, it's very worthwhile taking a look. It's a broad reach within specifically the automotive industry. Okay, we're now going to get into kind of the webinar series. As many of you know, this is the third webinar we have. We've had first two. One was in May about China plant closures, relocations, consolidations. That was primarily for companies who are downsizing or restructuring their China operations in light of the current move to the current trend to diversify manufacturing and supply chain from China into Mexico. That was the first webinar around the China operations. Second webinar was yesterday. We talked about the challenge of sourcing key industrial components from Mexican suppliers. And then today's webinar, the third one, this is going to be challenges of sourcing critical automotive components. Today is the only one of the three that's specifically industry targeted on the automotive sector. So right now, we'll now turn it over and take a look at the individual speakers that we have. I want to first introduce Gary Czonka, and then Gary, if you provide a background on yourself, and then Stefan, if you would follow up Gary.
Sure. Again, thanks, Alex, and I'd like to thank East West and Harris Bricken and Global Auto Industry for inviting me to speak. I'm the president owner of Skojet. We are a product design, precision machining, and international manufacturing company. We have offices we're headquartered here in the US, but we have offices in Ninghai, China, Bogota, Colombia, and Monterrey, Mexico. And we really help OEM manufacturers with handling their international manufacturing and logistics, kind of as a US-based company. So we handle all the international business for them, and they just are ordering from, say, us as a domestic supplier and eliminating all the fun customs duties and logistics of international business.
That's great. Well, thank you, Gary, and very glad you're on the call today. The next is Stefan Lochner, Senior Automotive Specialist with East West Associates, based in Mexico, San Luis Potosí. Stefan, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Good morning from Mexico still. Yeah. So just a few words about myself. I have 35 years experience in the automotive industry, mainly related to the German automotive industry. I'm German national, electronics engineer, but the last 23 years I'm living in Mexico and managing business here, up to positions as general manager for a smaller company, but also vice president for production and logistics planning for Robert Bosch, well known worldwide. So exposed to all types of supply chain issues, technical issues, and decision taking within the context of US, Mexico, China, and European automotive industry. Thank you.
That's terrific. Well, thank you very much. And based on that, we've obviously got a lot of knowledge on the call today, so and a lot of operational experience. So as we turn our attention now to following up and moving forward with the Q&A session, we just wanted to set the table a little bit and just kind of cover what's briefly going on in the marketplace so that everyone understands, right? We've got the current state that's going on. Obviously, there's a clear need to diversify supply chain from China to Mexico. It's affected by a lot of aspects. We all know, well aware of them: the pricing, logistics, tariffs, significant overdependence on China. There is real sourcing opportunities in Mexico. It's been going on for 5-6 years. We've been involved in the automotive sector in Mexico. Obviously, the benefits of close proximity to the U.S. and North America is one of them, the avoidance of the tariffs. However, as everyone knows who's been operating in Mexico for a long time, and I got in there in '96, there are real challenges to establishing Mexican supply chain markets. Mexico is not China. It's not a replacement for China. They're probably not a replacement for China, right? Just the size and scope and scale of China. So you got to figure out where in Mexico in the automotive sector that works for you, where in Mexico it is best fit for you. So we'll now turn our attention and kind of move into the Q&A session. And this session is going to be the focus for the 45 minutes conversations that we have, 45 to 50-minute conversation we're going to have between Stefan and Gary, as far as conversations going back and forth. We've got a series of questions. I see we just got a bunch more people signed in. That look, for everyone who wants to ask questions, on the right-hand side, you see the control panel. There's questions. Please put out your questions and send those to me, and then I will ask the speakers. So why don't we kind of move into the questions right now that we've got that have come in. And first of all, as we're kind of setting the stage for sourcing, particularly sourcing critical automotive components from Mexico. Stefan and Gary, I just want to kind of set the stage there. We've talked about this before, right? That Mexico is not China. You're not going to Mexico necessarily for pricing as reason number one. You're going there for the proximity. You're going for the flexibility of the labor force. Stefan and Gary, can you all talk a little about that as we're setting the table for this conversation about the benefits, why you're going to Mexico and the challenges you see there, and then we will drill down on the different components.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm coming at this from the perspective of I've moved to different countries and set up operations. So when I'm giving my descriptions, it's from my personal experience. The most important thing I think everybody needs to understand, and you did mention that, Alex, is that China and Mexico are not the same, not just geographically, but costs. If you're doing this strictly for cost purposes, you're trying to move out of China and build it for the same cost in Mexico. That's not going to happen. The majority, a large part of materials, raw materials, are coming from Asia or from Europe. And Mexico is processing those materials. So right off the bat, you're probably at a 20 or 30% premium just for the costs associated with bringing those goods in. I think, Stefan can probably elaborate a little bit more because he's on the ground there, but that's been my experience so far.
Yeah, I would 100% back up what Gary said. Exactly the same impression. And another aspect, if you compare China and Mexico, it's a different way how to do business. Mexico is a little bit slower. Yeah. The companies would right now not receive you with open arms and try to get business because they are a little bit overwhelmed by the rush that is happening right now into Mexico. About 20 years ago, the government started a lot of programs to promote Mexico as a production country or place to produce. The wages are being kept low, and they are fairly low in international comparison. But lately, this did not work anymore because we did not find the way how to keep technology at a level which developed in Asia, for example. Yeah. So everything that needs a high technology level right now would be a new startup in Mexico and would be a long way to go to establish the supply base for that.
Yeah, and I think when we're referring to technology, we're not referring to manufacturing processes. I think, Stefan, maybe you can clarify, but we're talking more like the PCB side of things or the electronic side of things. versus, not necessarily the manufacturing processes.
Correct. You're right. Mhm.
And
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, we just had to put, just looking at the questions that have come in. We've got one that's come in, talk about specifically the electronics. This company is an electronic supplier. And looking at, Stefan, you've talked about this, Gary, you've talked about electronic suppliers in Mexico for the automotive sector. And then there's a pretty broad sector there. Can you talk about the electronic components, the suppliers in Mexico, about the capacity they've got and the capabilities they have for automotive electronic suppliers in the, Mexican electronic suppliers for the automotive sector?
Yeah, the main players in the electronic sector are either Chinese or European players, or even American, that are supplying directly to the OEMs. Yeah, and they some of them do design like Bosch, Continental, and others, the big ones, but a lot of the smaller suppliers are only able to do build to print, meaning you would need to have a designed product, and they would build the PCB for you. But the PCB, the board itself, would be an import from China. Probably the components would come from China, and it would simply be the assembly in Mexico. So right now we are lacking the full supply chain. The PCB board industry, the production of PCB boards itself, the layers and all this, there are only existing two businesses in Mexico that could do that. And if we look for competitive pricing, they would definitely not be as competitive as Chinese supply base. So as a conclusion, yes, it is possible to build the electronics here, mainly with imported components. And another point is, if you look for a full product, meaning housing, connectors, PCB and everything assembled, this would probably be a different business doing it. Yeah? You have specialists doing the PCB assembly, and you have others that would do the housing and all this, the assembly. Yeah, it's not as integrated as in China.
Certainly, yes, yeah. Do you see, two follow-up questions came in, Stefan and Gary, about the electronics suppliers in Mexico. Do you see, number one, do you see a growth in Mexico of the greater PCB development? In other words, of trying to get more vertical suppliers in the PCB business. Do you see that going on in Mexico now in the next 3 to 5 years?
I would probably say it's really from electronics side. What I've seen happening is China factories are starting to set up operations in Mexico, and they're probably still a couple years out. As far as local Mexico supply base, the supply base is growing. There's definitely enough workers. Workers are not the kind of restricting or the constraining part of Mexico's growth. They are not as vertically integrated. That's probably another big factor compared to, say, like the Chinese, where we have factories that they have their own tool design. They make their own tools. They do their own injecting and die casting. Mexico is more where they do injection molding and they do it extremely well. And, you know, they'll run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but they're only doing injection molding. That's kind of another thing, that a large majority of the tooling is either coming from Europe or China. You won't find very much domestic tool making. When they are making it, it's usually for their own purpose, the factory's own purpose, because of maybe a short lead time. But they're going to try to outsource that tool. Not, even if they make a tool there, the design is still usually done over in China.
Yes, I agree with what Gary said. In the last years, at least in San Luis Potosí area, I recognized the trend that Chinese companies came over, setting up business, struggling with the cultural differences, yeah, and their expectations, yeah, and it's a little bit staggering right now. It will need another push, another motivation to bring more business from China, with technology from China to Mexico. And I also agree the Mexican suppliers are mainly related to metal and plastic molding, rubber, all the things that would not need would not directly play into the electronics industry. Yeah, it's only components for the electronics and the automotive industry. So the real electronic industry is still inherited by Chinese or European or American companies.
Stefan,
Right.
Stefan, let me ask you a question on this. It's one thing to look to the private sector and the Chinese or whoever to bring in their technology and their know-how and set up shop and do it. It's another thing to, as a matter of public policy, to look to the government or the states to help fill in that void. Do you see any evidence of that taking place at this point? Is the government recognizing they have a deficiency here and they need to increase training or development capacity? Do you see any movement on that point?
Well, in the past years, there were big programs from the Mexican government to promote certain industry sectors, specifically electronics, automotive, aerospace, all the technology-driven sectors. These programs still exist, which means you are tax exempt and things like that. But the real promotion of education, technology transfer, and all this is coming from the industry itself. Yeah. The current government, I have to say, is not really focusing on this area. It leaves it up to the industry to promote itself. Yeah. So it's more the private sector that is promoting cooperations with universities, setting up engineering centers, and so on. By the way, very successful, yeah, but limited to their own needs, of course, yeah. So we cannot expect that a company would try to create technicians for another one or engineers, yeah.
Would you say you deterioration on this point relative to the Fox and Calderon administrations as compared to AMLO and what's going on now? Because it seems like, you know, anecdotally looking in from the outside at this point, as I do, it seems that that's the case, that they're not, that
Yes.
the Obrador administration is not as, you know, focused on these types of considerations as say the Fox was or Calderon.
Definitely true. Definitely true.
Which could change again. You know, these administrations are locked in for 1 6-year period, 1 sexennium.
Yeah, it's another 3 years to go.
Yeah,
You never
Stefan, let me ask you a question about the because we're talking about these suppliers, about the electronic suppliers. If we're looking at some of the supply base and looking at some of the other areas, such as metal stamping, fabrication, we've talked about that. We've talked about injection molding, extruded plastics. Why those sectors, there's a large variety of available suppliers. Can you and Gary talk about for the fabrication, for the injection molded plastics? That seems like a pretty broad availability of suppliers and very good capacity. And can you all talk about why?
Yeah, I would like to start with injection molding, for example. It's an industry which has a very broad application, yeah, from appliances to plastic bottles, whatever, yeah. So it's easier for a business to go into, or for a company to go into such type of business and gaining experience with products that are not as demanding as automotive products. Yeah, we have to be conscious that the automotive industry is one of the most demanding industries itself. Yeah, with all the restrictions. So to enter this type of industry, you have to have experience, which you cannot gain if you're not allowed to enter. Yeah, so it's a vicious circle, and especially injection molding provides possibilities. Yeah, you do something for appliances where it's not that tight dimensionally as it will be in the automotive. You learn about the components you use. You learn about the plastic materials and yeah. So all this is easier than in the electronics industry, where you already have to start with a very high level of technology. Yeah. At least this is my point of view to this.
And Gary, would you agree with that?
I would, and molding and fabricating, stampings, CNC machining, those are, I'll even call it, old technologies. People have been doing them, and it's been, the industries were there, and they're needed for products just even outside of automotive. And that's one of the reasons that, it's kind of a core that they do. And there's a lot of companies doing there. And I completely agree with Stefan. It comes down to the technology and the learning curve, the startup curve that's required to get those businesses launched. And from the automotive perspective, it's almost like its own club per se. Automotive is risk averse, so they aren't going to necessarily take a chance on a startup or somebody that's doing electronics, but maybe not in automotive already. So automotive tends to bring their supply base with them, encouraging existing suppliers to set up operations there. So it's very hard for startups to want or willing to risk the investment required.
Agreed. We just got a couple questions on steel that just came in. We were talking about raw materials, and we'll get to it. But can you talk a little bit about the steel side? I mean, you compare Mexico steel, the volume of Mexican steel versus China. It's Mexico, I think, is what 20 million tons, or 200 tons, and China's like 1,000. But a specific question came in. You talk about steel specifically. The question is pig iron and scrap steel raw materials readily available in Mexico? You all know that.
I can't speak to that.
Okay. Black steel, meaning carbon steel, is readily available in Mexico. Anything else, especially stainless steel, is all imported. Yeah, there is one possibility to buy in Mexico stainless steel, rolled stainless steel, but yeah, that's basically all. Yeah, but
let me inject one thing too on the steel too. When it comes to imported steel, something to keep in mind is there's been a lot of trade remedy, anti-dumping, and countervailing duties attached by Mexican investigations to foreign steel. So if you're going to go that route, keep that in your mind.
It's just, so Stefan, if you're bringing in steel, or this person is looking for scrap steel, raw materials, where is the steel coming in to Mexico right now? Because there's not a ton of domestic steel production in Mexico. Where is that steel coming from?
Yeah, the main source is Korea right now. Yeah, surprisingly, Korea. India is trying to get a big share right now, and the Chinese also tried to move sales from the US to Mexico, but most of the businesses that are linked to the American market are hesitant to take the Chinese steel because of possible restrictions that could happen if you use the Chinese steel and sell it back to the US. Yeah,
Right.
which is not the case with the Korean one. Yeah, because it's the import of Korean steel to the US is only limited to a certain volume, but not as a finished product coming from Mexico. Yeah, so that's a big advantage.
Stefan, how much of that U.S. steel is going down for use in Mexico?
Of US,
yeah, U.S. produced steel.
US produced steel. Well, my experience is limited to the tube business. Yeah, and especially stainless steel tubes. Yeah. About 30% of our steel came from the US, and the remaining 70% came from somewhere else, mainly Korea.
When we're talking about Mexico, to me, that's always one of the challenges of Mexico is the, as it relates to the raw materials. We've talked about, Gary, you noted several times, like magnesium, 80% of that's controlled by China, right? So that nickels, those costs are being affected. Can you all talk about, in terms of the raw materials, if they're coming in from other places, how that is affecting the supply chain, both, Gary, from your point around magnesium and steel, but also for the plastics or electronics or resins that are used in Mexico?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what we found, especially over the pandemic, was a lot of resins. It's not just coming from China, but a lot of the specialty resins are being produced either in Europe or other parts of Asia, like Korea and Japan. And so, if you have bulk like polyprop and some HDPEs, those can be sourced even local areas, like Colombia has a good polypropylene production. But Mexico has, again, some, but it's just volume product, standard product. Automotive, we require specialty products for a lot of our parts, meat heat or chemical resistance, things like that. Metals, again, the majority of the raw materials we're finding are coming in from China or Europe, and that tends to be the issue over and over, is that raw materials, China has such they've kind of taken the market, and it doesn't encourage investment from other countries because they don't want or know they can't compete because they don't have the subsidies.
Right, that China's offering.
Yeah.
Stefan, would you agree with that?
Yes, definitely true. And one big example, stainless steel 304. Yeah, it's a very common steel in China, and you would pay about 3 times the Chinese price in Mexico just because of the pricing structure. The Chinese do not know things like any adders, yeah, for the specific contents of the stainless steel. They simply have a price. But if you go and look up the steel prices in the US, you will need to add a premium for each single content of the steel, yeah, which makes it very complex and in the end expensive. Yeah, so if you would like to compare, it's 1 to 3 times more expensive probably in Mexico to get the same 304 stainless steel than in China. And talking about volume, if you are importing high volume of steel and plastic components and then you can have competitive prices. The structure of the market is completely different than in China. You are not able to buy low volume on good prices because you would always have an somebody that would sell it to you, but only for a premium. Yeah, because everything has to do with volume here, and this seems to be much easier in China due to the pure size of the market.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I definitely would agree with Stefan about that. You know, one of the things we've encountered, because we're like low to, I'll say mid volume, you know, a few thousand pieces to 100,000 pieces is kind of our sweet spot. And whenever we're getting costing, a lot of our partners are saying, well, we have to get it from distributors. And those middlemen are marking up the materials considerably, and probably another 20% over the 30% just to bring the material in.
Right. Right. Well, and that we you know we hear that constantly in the marketplace now. We got a question specifically on the foundry business. Questions around the foundry business is can either one of you talk a little bit about the foundry business in Mexico as far as it relates to automotive? How many foundries are there in Mexico? Does Mexico have a pretty significant foundry business? I don't know the answer to that.
I found there's a decent amount, but what I'm going to caution everybody, and this it doesn't matter whether it's injection molding, stamping, you know, forgings. Mexico is, I'll say, at capacity. There have been so many people that because of supply chain disruptions are trying to relocate to Mexico. Okay.
Yeah.
And the factories are running at capacity. They're not taking, like if you send a bulk RFQ over, it's very likely they're not even going to respond to you because they don't need the work, and it's going to require you to. The other big aspect is Mexico is a lot about relationships. So if you don't have contacts already, or you don't have relationships with suppliers down there, you're going to have a difficult time getting a response. So there's factories, there's, you know, the capability to produce, but, you know, people going down or trying to get business launched down there now, it's gonna take time. People are gonna have to spend time there or use a service, you know, like East West to help get these introductions, because you you know, Mexico, Latin America are family oriented. And what I mean by that is that, you know, their family ties and relationships are very important to them. So, you know, we're used to in the US, we're gonna, we want an RFQ, we find a company online or, you know, through another contact, and we send them an email, sometimes don't even send, you know, give them a call first, say, hey, here's an RFQ, you know, I need this package quoted by this date. That's not how it works in Mexico, and it's important for people to understand that you're going to have to establish a relationship with somebody there, get communication going if you really want your RFQ to be considered seriously. Now, having said about the capacity, there is a willingness on lower tiers, on 2s and 3s, they're willing to invest. If you are willing to do the contracts, they're willing to either purchase the equipment, or in, you know, we've done some cases where we've purchased equipment and put it in facilities, and they run that equipment and process parts for us, you know, only our parts through that equipment. Those are possibilities for people, but no matter what industry, it seems that they're at capacity as far as equipment, not labor, not people, because there's a lot of, with everything that's gone on with some of the other South American countries like Venezuela, there is a large influx. And in fact, the president of Mexico is actually trying to encourage, you know, people from the other countries to stay in Mexico. The problem is everybody feels like we've got to Mexico now, you know, we're so close to the US, we want to push over. But they've had some success in, you know, keeping people there. So labor isn't an issue. It really comes down to machine capacity, availability.
Yeah, and ultimately to investment. Yeah, the Mexico is definitely not as risk oriented as China. Yeah, so that's one of the reasons why it takes much more convincing and personal relationship, because trust is the basis for the business here. Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I mean, we've talked a lot about the challenges in Mexico kind of come down to having those relations with Mexican suppliers, right? Stefan, you're there on the ground, Gary, going there a lot. We've got the relations on the ground with suppliers, having that trust with them, the capacity, because a lot of them have the capabilities, they just don't have the capacity right now. So it's encouraging them to work, develop to increase that capacity. The volumes that are required, in some cases, people complain about the volumes because these companies are so overwhelmed right now. They're looking for the high volume, particularly in the larger OEM space. And then the pricing is not going to be as competitive as China. When you all are talking to these suppliers, for instance, the tier 2, tier 3 Mexican suppliers, they seem to have, and Stefan and here, if you all can elaborate on this, they seem to have the good capacity. They may not always have all the certificates. They may have some of the basic certificates, but you all have spent spend time and are spending time for our clients developing those suppliers. Can you talk a little bit about that and how the suppliers you're dealing with, and then how you're getting them kind of supplier improvement programs, if you will?
Yeah, I would say from my experience, you know, because automotive and appliances from the US were really the first big industries down there, you know, the suppliers down there understand that they have to have processes and controls. A large majority of them have at least IATF, so that's positive. A lot also have ISO. So I don't think the quality is an issue compared to like China, where we have to teach people the very basics of, you know, process control and quality control and things like that. The second and third tiers, I think it's easier when we go down there to review, because they have at least some processes in place, and then it's just a matter of coaching them to the next level. versus trying to start from scratch with a lot of the Chinese partners we started with. So I think that's one of the pros of going to Mexico, is there's going to be less hand holding, and it's more about coaching them on your specific processes and controls. And the other aspect is it's easier to communicate, and we always say there's 3 languages you need to know if you're going to do international business. English is the international business language. Your native speaker, wherever that is, Mexico, Colombia, China, you need to have native speakers. And then of course the third is the technical language. It's not good enough to be able to just say hello, thank you, I'd like a drink. You need to be able to communicate technical specifications, requirements in their native language to be understood. So it's critical that that's taken into account, but it's much easier in Mexico than in a lot of the Asian countries we've dealt with.
Yeah, Stefan, you concur with that?
It's a very interesting aspect. Yeah, I didn't reflect that, but it's true. Yeah, if you are not able to communicate technical specification in the native language, you're not being understood. Yeah, I did not recognize this because I spoke Spanish all the time. Yeah, and I did not think about it. But you're right. It's definitely one of the success factors. Yeah, and being that close to the US, the education towards the systems we are managing is more evident, more simply it's there. Yeah, you do not have to do the basic work anymore. Yeah, it's the culture is fairly close. Education system is fairly close to our expectations. So it's basically managing our expectations as customers, yeah, with the suppliers. Yeah, and this has to be done in the native language.
And Stefan, you're really referring to more of this tier 2 and tier 3 Mexican automotive suppliers. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about we've talked a little bit already about sourcing and operating in Mexico. One of the questions that we kind of kicked around earlier was that the automotive aftermarket space is a good place in Mexico. However, it's a tough market for Mexican suppliers who are to break into a tier 1, just because of the volumes that are required to get into. But there's lots of tier 2 and tier 3 Mexican suppliers that you're working with, you're identifying and qualifying, but they're not on the large ones. Can you talk a little about how you identify those companies, how you qualify them, those tier 2 and tier 3 Mexican suppliers, because they're playing a much bigger role now in supplying in Mexico, sourcing in Mexico. How do you find them? How do you qualify them?
Well, a very easy start is you go to a spare part to a aftermarket shop here, and you would find a vast series of products which looks very similar to the original one, and you wonder, where does it come from? Yeah, and then you see either made in China or you see made in Mexico. Yeah, hecho en Mexico, and this was the first point. The astonishing finding I had about 20 years ago, especially talking about things that often break in cars, yeah, like headlamps, taillights, and all this. I was wondering, where do all these things come from? Yeah, and there are really businesses you can find even through internet search, yeah, that are doing specific aftermarket parts, yeah, like those plastic injection parts, yeah, and they are openly advertising, yeah. A big part of the rubber industry, especially for the truck market, yeah, is also being produced here, but it's all related to the low to mid volume business, yeah. And of course, the aftermarket does not require, especially here, what is sold locally, does not require the same certification and the same standards. Yeah, nobody would expect that a tail light that is red when you buy it would still be red in the next 10 years. Yeah, it could fade out a little bit. Yeah,
Right.
and nobody would care about that, but all OEMs would. Yeah, so it's easier to enter this market, yeah, and provide product that is doing what it's intended for, yeah, for a certain time. And there are even possibilities to develop this market or some of these suppliers into the next stage. But this is what Gary said before. Yeah, this is the time-taking process. Yeah, and it needs some patience to follow up and coach.
Certainly, yeah, and Seven, you and I have worked on a couple of automotive aftermarkets, and there is a good market in Mexico for that. Here's anything you wanted to add on that?
No, I think Stefan covered it pretty well. I mean, if you're going to partner with somebody down there, you need to understand, as I mentioned earlier, that they're not as vertically integrated. So let's take, tail lights, for example. They may be able to do all the injection molding, ultrasonic welding, adding seals, pressing in inserts. But if you ask them to do ISO test, like say a saltwater test, a spray test, intrusion test, vibration testing, something like that, to validate, they're probably not going to have those resources in-house, and they're going to have to subcontract that. So, I would say just, with caution, anytime, you're starting new business, make sure you understand the suppliers, not just their manufacturing capabilities, but what testing they have available, what their capabilities are, validation as well, to make sure they're going to meet your requirements.
And can you all talk on that? There's a question came in around tooling. Is Mexico producing much tooling itself, or are they getting a lot of the tooling out of China or other places?
No, as mentioned earlier, there's, like, for instance, Monterrey. It's a fairly large city in Mexico, right? I mean, a lot of people have heard of it. And I was only able to locate 5 tool makers, and 3 of those were kind of in-house for doing their own tools, and the other 2 were so busy. And when we did meet with those suppliers, a lot of them were saying even their designs, they aren't necessarily doing the designs in-house. They're subcontracting that to China, and then building the tools in-house. So you have a small base of available suppliers for tool making, and then of the ones that can do it or have the available capacity, the design's probably still coming from China for the most part, unless you have your own tool design in-house, and you can submit that to them, provide that to them.
And how about the design? I mean, are Mexican manufacturers have their own design capabilities, or you're taking more of that to them? You have to go to a Mexican design shop.
For the most part, you're taking designs to them. As Stefan alluded, they're a build to print type of manufacturing country. They're not going to it's not that they don't have engineering down there. There's engineering groups, but in-house, as I mentioned, they're fairly vertical in that, you know, they want to do injection mold, so they do injection mold extremely well, extremely efficient. They have good processes and controls, but I was even a little surprised that a lot of them don't even order their own material because the automotive sector controls contracts and supply and who you're allowed to use. A lot of them were just arranging the deliveries from the suppliers. They weren't paying for or even arranging like the contracts. Those were already done by, you know, like Dodge or somebody already. So that's another interesting aspect that you know, if you're using a subcontractor down there or a supplier, make sure you understand what your responsibilities are as far as getting the parts produced, whether you're going to have to negotiate and order the material and then schedule deliveries based on production, or if the factory will do that for you.
Stefan, you find the same thing?
Yeah, true, and mainly driven by the maquiladora business. Yeah, for many years it was also promoted in Mexico to do not own the material. Yeah, the material needs to be owned by an non-Mexican entity, and you could import it tax-free and then export tax-free again, and you would only pay the workers and the taxes for the value add you're doing in Mexico. And this created a little messy situation here. You cannot count on everybody being set up the same way with its supply chain and the thoughts behind it. Yeah.
That's interesting. I never understood the basis of it. I just knew the why. So thanks, Stefan. That kind of clarifies, you know, what the why of it.
Yeah.
We had a question pop in here around around headlights, taillights, interiors, like the headliners. That's number 5 on our chart. Stefan and Gary, can you all talk a little bit about for the Mexican automotive suppliers of these interior products of the like headliners? There seems to be as good availability of that. Can you talk a little bit about the capacity of those and for the capability of those manufacturers?
The market is basically basically the all the interior products that are linked to a specific car model are being built by international supply base. Yeah, meaning companies that were brought in by the OEMs to produce for them because it's bulky items. You don't want to send them too far. So this market is basically distributed in within international acting supply base. Then you have another supply base that is for interior components that are more or less universal, meaning seat coverage, yeah, some smaller plastic items, frames, things like that. These are falling into the normal injection or fabric manufacturing, yeah, where you have a vast opportunity to find suppliers here. But this is then the tier 2, tier 3, or even no real tier situation, yeah, where you would need to work with them to get to the expected level of quality.
All right, we've got 2 more questions popped up. So it is now 1 o'clock. So the webinar is officially over. If you need to leave, we certainly understand. We've got 2 more questions and we'll stay and answer those. but it is now officially over. So again, thank Harris Bricken and Global Auto Industry.com for sponsoring with East West this event. Thank Gary and thanks Stefan. But if you need to step out now, but Gary, let me ask you these two questions that popped up. One was on was welding fabrication. We talked earlier about tubes. There seems to be a pretty good supply. Stefan, you were talking about exhaust tubes, seat frame tubes, but welding fabrication, there seems to be a good availability of supply across that. Can you talk about those Mexican suppliers, their capabilities, and the capacity for that for the welding and fabrication in Mexico?
Yes, well, yes, you have various companies doing welding, especially welded tubes, carbon steel and stainless steel. Yeah, you have centers where you find those. It's San Luis Potosí, it's Monterrey, it's Querétaro. Yeah, mainly. You also have the international ones. So there is less capacity on those ones. Yeah, and especially now with the reduction of exhaust tubes in the future, they would be looking for additional business. I think those would be the businesses that would be hungry for more.
Certainly, yeah. And then the final question came in around, talked about how we got a lot of U.S., a lot of European firms moving back into Mexico from the early days when we were a lot of Western companies, European companies were in Mexico in the early 2000s, right? And then they left and went to China, and it kind of had a devastating effect on Mexico. And now they're coming back. So the question is from the registrant is that affecting relationships with current Mexican suppliers? I mean, they're obviously benefiting now, but is there kind of in the back of their mind a concern that, okay, Westerners, Europeans, Americans came in earlier, got a lot of suppliers there, and then left with China? Is that in the back of the minds of the current Mexican suppliers? And how do you discuss that with them if you're trying to get them to improve their investments?
Yeah, I would say probably the biggest effect that came out of that is that, where in the past the investment, they would be more willing to just make investment based on on kind of quoting and the promise of business. Now it's much more contract related, and they want to be sure that they're going to get a return on their investment.
Stefan?
Yeah, I think there is a certain reluctance of the Mexican now to cooperate because there was a certain level of technology available, of structure available, and when everything got pulled out, it was quite a brutal move to China. Yeah, and it took some while to find different business, what to do here in Mexico with the people, because the people stayed here, and we lost a little bit the level of education and technology we had before. Yeah, I remember that Guadalajara was the Silicon Valley of Mexico before 2000. Yeah. There was a big sign when you arrived there or by plane, and it's no longer there. Yeah, for good reason, because when IBM pulled the hard disk production to China, a few hundred people lost their jobs. Yeah, and the technology went away. Yeah.
Yeah.
And now it's I can understand there are sort of hard feelings. Yeah. Maybe we need to wait another 10 years, yeah, to overcome this hurdle. Yeah.
I think one thing that I kind of want to come back to is, the whole build to print issue. Mexico is not, they're not as entrepreneurial, I think that's the way to describe it, right? You know, you go to China, you give somebody a basic design, and 2 days later you've got a sample, right? In Mexico, they're not going to go out and you know, develop new business, right? In hopes of getting a new you know, providing a new service. I think they lag in that they want to have contracts, they want to have business, and then they'll do development. I think that's maybe one of the reasons, like when IBM left, you know, normally when an industry leaves an area, right, there's residual, you know, obviously not as much business, but it stays on because there's some expertise, and somebody says, well, I know this, so I'm going to start my own business, maybe not making computers, but continuing some type of electronics. And that's, I think, just one of the cultural things you deal with.
Fair point. Yeah, but that's a fair point. I guess it cuts both ways, right? There's positives and negatives. So right now we are already a little over. So I will. Well, now we've kind of answered all the questions. We got a few more outstanding, but we'll. The final question, the final one that came in a minute ago, was you were talking a little bit of the cultural side, Gary, and the question was, how do you deal with intellectual property protection in Mexico? That doesn't seem to be as much of an issue in Mexico as it does in China. Would you both agree with that?
I would definitely agree. But just like any country, you know, you need your legal agreements, right? That's your best protection. Doesn't matter whether it's China or Mexico or, you know, the Philippines, Vietnam. You need your you know, protections. But culturally, I don't think they're as willing to take your property and compete. Again, they want to produce product to print. They're not going to develop their own product, change it, or, you know, change your product slightly and sell it. It's not the culture.
Right. Stefan, would you agree with that?
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. Yeah, it's not a copy country. It's they would protect your property, your intellectual property. Yeah. Especially if we are talking about some hardware, yeah, some product you could sell. Yeah. What needs to be controlled is if you have scrap or overproduction or things like that. You need to protect that this is not going into a black market. Yeah.
Right.
Good point.
We see that pretty much in every sector we operate, right? Every market, every country we operate.
Yeah. Yes.
Stefan, Gary, thank you all very much for taking the time. That's a very valuable, went almost an hour Q&A session of questions the residents were asking. So thank you all very much for taking that much time to share that knowledge. So with that concludes the webinar about sourcing the critical automotive components in Mexico. Thank you very much. And Stefan and Gary, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.